So, hi everybody. Thanks for coming and joining us. And let us know if you're watching live or comment replay, hashtag replay if you are watching it later on. All right. So, we are talking about trauma again. So, our question for you is, have you ever noticed how, your body reacts when you're under pressure? Have you ever wondered how a single event from your past could still actually be affecting you today? Trauma isn't just a momentary experience. It sends essentially like ripples through every part of our lives. And today we'll explore these ripple effects and understand how past traumas kind of continue to shape our present and our current time. And we're going to go ahead and dive in and just kind of find ways to calm those waters, okay? So just a brief review, but last week we talked about trauma in general, what it is, how traumas are like, essentially like invisible scars and hidden wounds we carry around with us. And then today we're going to dive further into trauma and what it can cause, its far-reaching forces, and a bit about how it impacts, our relationships. Drum roll, right? Like we all know this, but if you have any questions, leave them under the video, okay?
So, all right. So, what do we do when trauma hits us and our nervous system? So, trauma can influence our emotional, mental, social, and physical health, right? And stress overwhelms the body and mind in activating the nervous system's fight, flight, fawn, or freeze response. And in our Untrauma workshop, we dive into it in depth, and you will learn about 4 more responses beside the fight, flight, fawn, or freeze response. So let's talk about this for a moment. Just let's start with the fight. This response involves confronting or standing up against the stressors or threat, and it's characterized by a readiness to engage in conflict or challenge. And adrenaline is pumping through your body, and you are ready to pounce on the threat and ready to attack. Then the next one is flight. And this response involves a desire to escape or avoid the stressors of threat. And it's marked by a tendency to seek safety through avoidance or physical withdrawal. And we can't think all that straight anymore. Our body just begins to run, shunting blood to vital organs and muscle to propel you forward. And then another response is the freeze response. And this involves a state of immobility or a lack of action. And it may include feeling paralyzed or unable to respond, and often as a way to play dead in the face of danger.
And then last, we actually have fawn. And that's actually a response, many of us might actually not even really know about. Usually we're just taught, the fight, flight, and freeze response, but not the fawn response. And this is a less commonly discussed response, and it involves seeking to please or appease the stressor or the threat. So in a way, people pleasing, right? And people exhibiting a fawn response may honestly prioritize meeting the needs of others to avoid conflicts. And you hear it in society all the time. Oh, she's such a people pleaser. Oh, he's a people pleaser. Or, oh man, I'm such a people pleaser. That's actually a lot of times a possible trauma response from something that occurred a long time ago. In these stages, they can often occur without us truly realizing that our nervous system is actually on high alert, either because we are out of tune with our body, or and this is more likely, that our nervous system is literally constantly on high alert due to previous trauma that these unseen nervous system responses force shape. They shape our life without our conscious awareness, and it's simply our new norm. And then, hi, Carol, I'm on recovering people pleaser. Yes, good, awesome. Keep going with that.
Okay, and now it can happen that far-reaching effects of trauma occur when our overburdened nervous system is unable to properly digest stressful experiences, ultimately leading to post-traumatic stress syndromes. And keep in mind, this is not always the case. So per the Cedron Institute, 70%, just hear that, 70 of US adults have suffered significant trauma and up to 20% have PTSD. And common trauma responses, just to name a few, include intrusive thoughts such as flashbacks or nightmares, general anxiety that we can't seem to shake, sadness or depression, as well as avoiding people, places, or things that remind us of the trauma, therefore impacting our relationships, careers, and overall well-being in one way or another. And we end up then pushing people away. We avoid others that might have witnessed the trauma or know about it. And we may keep to ourselves. We may not want to open up to others in fear of more trauma. And we may constantly feel nervous about what we say, how we say it, and how the other person perceives it. We feel less than, not worthy, not worth fighting for that promotion. The list could go on and on and on. And it's truly astonishing to see how these unseen forces of our trauma can shape our life.
Yeah, it's quite a doozy, actually. So let's actually talk about, how past experiences can lead to trauma reactions in the present moment, okay? So trauma is really less about the event itself and more about how we respond to it. I'm going to repeat that, okay? So trauma is less about the event itself, and it's more about how we actually respond to that situation, that moment. You know, Granted, though, there's some events that have a greater tendency, of course, to result in trauma than others. Taking, for example, childhood trauma, like childhood abuse, those are like those obviously known traumatic situations. But even then, it's also an addition to that, it's also how we respond to it, to what extent it then will traumatize us. And I think most of us know that trauma experienced as a child, it has long lasting repercussions on how we live as an adult. It really does. And many trauma related effects can be felt long after the initial shock has subsided. And our long term physical health may also change as a result of what we experience as a child. And so, if you think about it, when you respond to that childhood abuse, for example, the way you respond is then possibly the way that you're going to respond to traumas from then on. That's going to be your response system. That's going to be your trauma response and the way you manage and deal. It might be tough to discern the long-term impacts of childhood trauma in our adult lives. For example, like small decisions can actually have big results, such as staying in a job that makes us feel miserable, right? But this choice may actually have roots in internalized, self-doubt, but that was caused by a traumatic event of some sort in the past.
Yeah, and the Yet Foundation, which is a non-profit organization that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for teens and young adults, divides trauma into 3 categories that we can all experience. So let's talk about them for a moment. So the first one is emotional trauma. And these are the feelings traumatic events leave us with and are characterized by feeling unsafe in our own body. And this emotional trauma can alter our brain function and lead to an overarching sense of hopelessness. And one example would be surviving emotional and or physical abuse, right? Often these individuals shrink back, flinch and shut down when it comes to conflict in their adult life or live after leaving that abusive partner.
All right. And then you have the second category, which is the complex trauma. And this is when you are essentially you're experiencing a series of traumatic events that can have a lasting impact on your mental and emotional well-being. So again, going back to that example of like enduring long-term repeated, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse during childhood. And one abuse builds just on top of another one, and it just builds and builds and builds. Another example would be growing up in a dysfunctional or neglectful family environment where, to this day you simply don't really feel quite seen or worthy of anyone's time because that was not something that was given to you when you were a child. There's so many different types of examples and ways that can play out. So for me, and this is actually something that I figured out after the fact, but my experience of complex trauma comes from consistent buildup working as a nurse and constantly seeing just, the gut wrenching, traumatizing things that you have to see. You have a patient pass away in one room and you have to walk in smiling into your other patient's room, pretending like nothing happened. That's really hard to do. And it's something that I didn't even realize that it was traumatizing me until I started working with trauma techniques. And until I decided to kind of change my nursing field completely and escape the situation that I was in.
Yeah, and third and last, we have secondary trauma. So secondary trauma is also known as vicarious trauma, and it refers to being a witness to trauma. So witnessing a traumatic event can impact our emotional health and is just as deserving of support, empathy, and compassion as actually experience the trauma. So think 9/11 or a wife witnessing her husband's heart attack. So something we actually tend to overlook and not really consider, and that falls into this category, is actually the consumption of violent or graphic movies or movies that contain abuse or anything that can trigger it. So, and the same goes for TV shows or video games. So if we are triggered by the incident in the movie, we likely have an underlying trauma related to it, and this can traumatize us further. And overall, it can lead to secondary trauma as well in general.
Yeah, and that's actually something that a lot of people, I don't think we even consider that to be a source of trauma. Or the news, guys, the news. I'm not even going to get into that, but the news these days. Oh, anyway, there are so many variations of trauma. And, while serious accidents, they can cause the physical injuries, they might actually or will a lot of times trigger a psychological trauma that can result in, anxiety, depression, if it's really bad, PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. And then instances of physical or sexual assault, abuse, violence, they can also leave profound emotional wounds, often, necessitating years, and I mean years of therapeutic intervention for recovery. And, then there is the individuals exposed to trauma in the workplace, such as first responders or healthcare professionals, that, for example, were dealing with pandemic patients who now may experience significant mental health challenges due to everything they witnessed and endured. We have a family friend who is dealing with that now. And you know, we have the loss of a loved one as another example, or that's a prevalent source of trauma that can, just really lead to grief and depression, and you end up falling into a hole that you just can't quite seem to get out of. And then we also have, of course, you know, to consider communities and just the widespread trauma in communities that can result from, war or natural disasters like what happened in Hawaii with all the fires. You know, they can all that foster that uptick and increase in PTSD and other mental health issues, and it's sometimes just overlooked. And then last example I kind of want to list is also chronic illnesses or disability. That can be traumatic, and it can be traumatic for the individual that's affected, but also for the family members, because that can be a lot for an individual in the family. And, just throwing it out there, seeking professional assistance and relying on support from loved ones is crucial, okay? For those who have undergone trauma that's severe. to initiate the healing process. But then we also, I think every single person is walking around with some sort of trauma that doesn't necessarily completely impact your life or you don't notice it, but would still greatly, I think we all would still very much greatly benefit from trauma management and clearing and releasing.
So, as you can see now, there are 3 different types of traumas and 4 nervous system responses to trauma that we just covered. And there are 4 more responses you will learn about in the Untrauma workshop, plus the 4 nervous system responses we just spoke about are all learned responses, like from childhood, where we figure out which response is the safest and best in scary circumstances. And all of us accumulate a lot of traumatic situations in our lifetimes. We even consider cutting your thumb while prepping the veggies for dinner as a trauma. It is a small one, but it is a physiological trauma and a brief shock to the nervous system, putting us into an alert state. And this all accumulate unless we have proper coping skills and strategies to manage our traumas. And you will learn more about that in the next 2 live talks coming up. We tend to forget or tend to not give enough credit to the impact of trauma and the unseen force that it plays in our role, impacting every aspect of our life.
So today, just starting to kind of summarize it, but we covered various responses to trauma and the different types of traumas we can experience. And, if this information is striking a chord with you or you want to learn more, come and check out our Untrauma workshop at www.healempowerlove.com. And in the workshop, we are going to tackle conscious, subconscious, generational, and collective traumas and the roles that they play in our life. And we'll be teaching techniques to clear them along with some other fascinating methods. Okay. And just last, gentle reminder again, we're not trained mental health professionals. So if you are experiencing trauma or need professional help, please consult with a qualified healthcare provider or mental health professional. If you are, however, looking for energetic release and clearing trauma out of your energy system, then we're it for you. Okay, so stay tuned for next week's live talk where we will unravel even more about trauma and its role as a silent saboteur when trauma remains unsolved. See you then.
Thank you for joining us.